In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head. This is Max Golding, and we have, of course, the fabulous Harriet Fraud. Hello,
Yay.
Harriet. And for today, we have a very special guest named Bethany Morris, who is an assistant professor of psychology at Point Park University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where she teaches and does theoretical and qualitative research. Dr. Morris is a transdisciplinary scholar whose work bridges critical psychology, literature, philosophy, history, psychoanalysis, everything else, film studies, like list maybe 50 other things. And before I forget, actually, huge thanks to our patrons, First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and of course, Liam. Big shout out for helping with the editing and social media. So
Yes.
anyways, Bethany, now that we're through our technological nightmare problems, hello, who are you? And so actually real quick, so critical psychology was a term thrown in there, and something else that you've also worked on and studied is community psychology. And so these two phrases, Harriet and I assume our listeners don't know a whole lot about because they're not really super mainstream. So what is critical psychology? What is community psychology? Why have most people never heard of these things? And why are you interested in these things?
And how do they relate to each other as well?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first off, thank you very much for having me on here. I'm not a longtime listener, but a new listener that's dedicated. So I'm happy for podcasts that are addressing certain issues like this. But community psychology is a relatively new branch of psychology that assumes a lot of the stuff that you all talk about here, that, the individual we study in psychology is always already socially embedded. So community psych looks at human suffering and flourishing as situated within the social, political, and the cultural. And it's a little bit different from traditional social psychology in that it doesn't look to investigate like how the individual functions within groups or how groups, produce interesting behaviors or cognitions, but rather how to understand that there really is no outside to the social, that the human subject is already constituted by the social rather than just like influenced by it. So it differs from a lot of the mainstream approaches to psychology because it assumes a number of things that I think traditional psychology assumes things, that is that a community psychologist or a critical psychologist would take issue with. So it assumes that, the individual is a sort of closed circuit or entity that like is unto itself. Whereas community psychology, and I argue psychoanalysis also, assume that the human subject is, a constellation of environmental factors and other people. So for example, one of the first sort of thought exercises I ask my students to do is, give me an example of something that they do entirely on their own without the assistance or interference of any other person. And, the answers are usually pretty much the same. Some get creative when they're like, I'll sleep outside with no bed that nobody else has built, and I'll be all by myself in the world, but we typically encounter the problem of language pretty quickly, whether they say like my dreams or my thoughts, they're mine. And I'm like, well, where did you get your language from? Right. And this idea that we inherit language as well as an unconscious from another, that's my argument anyway. And that, someone had to give them that language in order for them to form the thoughts they then believe to be their own. So that's kind of where community psychology starts. And then it looks to engage in like action orientation toward like evaluating programs, thinking about like community-based engagement through like non-profit organizations, different like community mental health outreach programs. So it's participatory action research mixed with advocacy, program evaluation, with all that built into these assumptions about the human subject.
Wow, that's a lot. Now I can also see why and how it could relate to Lacan, because Lacan has that idea that human beings invented a clock on the basis of which they said time is objective. But there was a subjective idea to measure time, and what time is was defined by people. So that it kind of shows the interdependence of us on human construction every place we turn. And I can see where it makes sense, community psychology, in terms of looking at how we're constituted. It kind of, Freud talked a little bit about instincts, which was off, but that you are the survivor of whatever family environment you were immersed in is very much an environmental thing, since family is the first community that children are in.
Quick question before we go on with that for Lacan, just because I assume a lot of listeners, even psychotherapists listening, right, if they're of like my generation of training, may not even know who Lacan is. If either of you could just give a little primer on who Lacan is and what makes Lacan a distinct human in psychology.
Yeah. Sorry, Harriet.
You go. You're the guest. You get a chance to go first.
Sure. Lacan is a French psychoanalyst practicing and preaching primarily in the 1940s through to the I think he died in 1980 something or other. But takes a lot of the work that Freud built with psychoanalysis and then marries it to some of the structuralist theory, looking at some like linguistic theory, right? And talking about how to basically bring Freud's insights into a concern for the contemporary subject that is grounded in language, that communicates, lives through speaking. And so with Lacanian psychoanalysis, you're not so much, forcing interpretations on things as much as listening to the way words work, the way language kind of constitutes us. And so, as you said, Harriet, like early family life, right? I always think about a child who's just trying to pick up language while also picking up like energy and like various emotions from hostility to acceptance and all of this stuff, while also trying to become this like autonomous subject, and having to make sense of things that don't make sense, right? The double meaning, double speak of language, and that is sort of how we kind of find ourselves as subjects later on in life, that we're trying to make sense of this early stuff too, Yeah,
that's really a good way of summarizing it, because what Lacan did was say that the unconscious of everyone is a language and works based on linguistic concepts, and that with every experience or utterance that you have, there's a double register. One is a conscious register and the other is an unconscious register. And that by listening to people, you can pick up both registers that we don't necessarily pick up.
Yeah,
and that is important.
Absolutely. And that signifiers that words mean different things to different people. There's not a universal understanding. So when I teach my students about this, we talk about like, okay, when you're a child, someone tells you you're a good girl or a good boy. And like that doesn't mean anything unto itself. You have to fill in the blanks of what that means. And that's going to be completely different for every single person. And yet we speak about it as if it's this like commonly understood term, to be a good boy or to be a good girl. And we can analyze that culturally too, how that changes, but it sort of moves through the human subject in a different way.
Yeah, I like to look at it the way New Marxism looks at it, which is that there's the real, and then the concrete real there, and then there's the thought. And they look like they're together and they have some correspondence, but they never really meet, like two railroad tracks that seem to meet in the distance, but they never really do connect. They relate, but they don't connect. And therefore, one has to really interrogate what other people mean and what oneself means, because it's not as apparent as some people would think it is.
But what do you mean? Sorry, I'm just really trying really hard there. Sorry.
No, that's great, right? Because I think Harriet and I could probably now talk for hours trying to address the question of what does it mean? And that is sort of the point of Lacanian theory, right? Is that you're going to keep speaking because of that gap that Harriet talks about between knowledge and speaking, or the being, that there's a fundamental gap that produces desire. It's what keeps us talking. Eventually we'll get to it, right? We'll just keep talking, and eventually there will be perfect understanding. And I think that's why it's so radical compared to traditional psychology, because some branches of psychology seem to assume that there's no gap, right? That we can really understand the human subject as an object, right? That has no desire, has nothing closed off to itself, right? That there's no split, and you can sort of perfectly know what a human subject or what a psychology of a person is without that gap. And I think that's troubling.
That's really important. It's what Lacan talks about, the mirror stage, where the child looks in the mirror and recognizes himself or herself or itself, themselves. But at the same time, it sees a backward image of a person who's transformed by just the recognition in the mirror. Mm-hmm. And so that we can't really nail it down. And it gives us a level of humility. Not that Lacan was very humble, he got quite arrogant, but nonetheless, there are contradictions in everyone. But still, that this sureness and this kind of reduction, and it's a particular critique of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which pigeonholes the complexity of a person's experience in order to diagnose her, him, or them into a pigeonhole that allows a medication. And it's exactly the opposite spirit from the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the DSM, because it says, look at the complexity rather than reduce it to simplicity and drug it.
Well, and this is so off, like when we had our little interview question things, like this is like, because now I'm so interested. Harriet, you'd missed the interview that I'd done with Catherine Liu, but it's one of the things that she had talked about like halfway through very passionately is like how frustrated she's become with psychology as, like I said, of myself being like a newer sort of generation of trained therapists, where psychoanalysis has really sort of been on the decline, right? Like when you take like a Psych 101 class, they often tell you Freud's full of shit, and it's all about, it's basically all about CBT, right? Like everything's sort of centrally behavioral at this point. I don't want to say everything, right? There's little pockets, but I mean, what do you get? So it sounds like the two of you, I'm vaguely familiar with Lacan. I've tried to read some Lacan. I found it to be like wildly inaccessible. I did understand some concepts and I thought it was really, really interesting. I almost think Lacanian analysis and the newer realm of like psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, as weird as that sounds, could be really beautifully married, I think, because of the sort of the elimination of boundaries and compartmentalization of different like psychic experiences. But anyway, that's maybe for another time. But I'm curious, I mean, I guess Bethany, you, since you're our guest, right, of like what, because you, if you're into the Lacanian, or if you call it Lacanian model, or just you're just a fan of it, and psychoanalysis generally, I mean, how do you think we got to this point, right, where like psychoanalysis is, it's not like underground, but it's almost like you almost have to be you have to be like careful, right? Like if you're around like therapists who like look around and be like, is it okay if I talk about psychoanalysis? Or are you gonna tell me that's not an evidence-based thing or something like that? Like, how do you think we got to this point in the psychology world?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of different trajectories you could follow there, right? Where, you know, Anna Freud comes over with some other psychoanalysts and spreads it in America, but it gets turned into maybe ego psychology, where it's about not addressing the unconscious, but really addressing how to shore up the ego, how to fight back against that anxiety that's present in the mirror stage, right? Like that Harriet mentions, where you see an image that you're supposed to identify with, but there's sort of like a gap, a disconnect between the image and the experience. And that's, you want to close that gap as much as possible. And so I think bringing those sorts of insights over to America, it got turned into almost like a marketing tool, right? I'm thinking of, in particular, Adam Curtis's documentary, The Century of the Self. He has a great elaboration on this, where in the 1960s, it turns into basically like subliminal perception marketing stuff that's not really anything, but it becomes, people get concerned about that. At the same time, psychology is really trying to marry itself to the empirical sciences. That I don't think it can do that, because you can't do away with human subjectivity, is my issue. And so I think a lot of the concern about Freud is because we want to, I think we really want to believe that science in psychology is the answer. And I think as soon as you start to wrestle with that, you have this like extra, you have this anxiety, this gap that is present, that is really disturbing. I mean, my theory is that this is what all contemporary horror movies are about, right? Like they're trying to demonstrate this, this gap between knowing thyself and having a part of the self that is completely foreclosed. That just kind of like pokes its way into your experience, and that is, there's not really a way to deal with that scientifically, I don't think, because by nature it's what doesn't, what can't be replicated or can't be reliably accessed by every single person, that sort of stuff.
Right.
Well, I think that it's really important that our listeners know a couple of things. One is that Lacan wrote in a deliberately difficult manner to try to replicate the thinking of the unconscious. Annika Lemaire wrote an amazing book called Lemaire's Lacan, which was authorized by Lacan himself, and it explains it very well and doesn't try to embody the kind of thinking that's hard to find and hard to follow, but rather makes a really excellent analysis. So if anybody's interested, they should try reading Lemaire's Lacan instead of Jacques Lacan himself. The other thing is it's a political decision. The United States differs from Europe in that to be a psychiatrist, you have to be an MD in the United States. You really don't in France and other places, because they understand the philosophic underpinnings that are not medical. But in order to be accepted in the American medical system and for insurance coverage, they try to make a scientific analysis, and they attribute people's psychology and their troubles to a hormonal or medical imbalance. Whereas people who are critiques of that kind of thinking show that every feeling, every act has its own biochemical concomitant. So if you want to measure people who are unhappy, of course there'll be an imbalance. Nobody has a perfect balance. And every mental state and every emotional state has a biochemical component. The end. But I think the American insurance and medical and pharmaceutical industries have colluded together to try to make psychology a medical scientific issue rather than a philosophic issue, looking at the subjectivity of an individual embedded as he, she, they are in a social network. So that it's a political move in our country as well that sort of is a tributary into a profit system. And
all of that kind of makes me think too that so capitalism and certain ways of thinking scientifically, I think, go hand in hand when you really start to compartmentalize and chop things up into little like waffly boxes, because I think anyone that's like lived in the real world knows that you can't, it's helpful. Like I make a lot of like to-do lists and I use my Google Calendar and crap, you have to do some waffle things. but things are a lot messier than that, actually, you know? And I think one thing that you said earlier, Bethany, about the horror films, this just came to mind. This is a Lacanian thing since we're talking about it, but I was thinking that science really likes to chop things up into smaller pieces to try to observe them. And that's kind of what all these slasher films are, right? It's like this terror of like, you know, I don't know, totally, it's a total stretch. But I also wanted to maybe do a Lacanian jump, because we were going to talk about BPD, right? Which is borderline personality disorder, is often, I think, the way that it's compartmentalizedly conceptualized within the medical model is that you have these cluster of symptoms and there's this pathological thing, and it's mostly women who experience borderline personality disorder. And, you know, also talking about slasher films and cutting, because often there's like self-harm and cutting and suicidality and everything. I wanted to ask, because you'd written about that in your Mad in America article, and just your conceptualization of borderline personality disorder from this perspective, which sounds like your perspective is very different than like, I don't know, I guess the mainstream or medical conceptualization of BPD. Sorry, it's a big jump, but I tried to kind of do what we were saying.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. I would just clarify that, you know, if we're going to watch good horror movies to talk about Lacanian psychoanalysis, it's not the slasher films. It's like the existential horrors like Hereditary. That's my only disclaimer. But
okay. Thank you.
But yeah, so I've taken a number of perspectives on borderline. It's something that's fascinated me since like my undergrad, because of this disclaimer that kept popping up, like 75% of people diagnosed typically are women. And I used to just believe that it was like this child of a sexist society and the psi complex coming together, right? But I think there's definitely some use in thinking about it that way and asking about the cultural discourses around borderline personality, as well as, you know, the very interesting clinical literature about it. But we can look at the symptoms too, right? Especially those linked, like you're saying, to issues of like impulsivity as maybe being less problematic when they're being exhibited by a man. So I think that's in there, right? The cultural and political considerations. But that the issue with that perspective is it only got me so far, in that it doesn't really address the person who is the one suffering, nor does it really address the fact that many people are quite disturbed by some of the behaviors of people with borderline, like you're saying, like self-harm, regardless of, you know, if that origin of the disturbance is in the culture, right? And so my understanding of BPD now is kind of informed both from like the Lacanian psychoanalytic as well as perspective, as well as the sociocultural phenomena that we see. So in Lacanian psychoanalysis, you would not have the typical like DSM disorders. You would not have like personality disorders, nor would you have personalities like we typically talk about them, like, you know, MBTI or like the big 5 personality traits. Instead, what we think of is subjective structures, so ways in which the subject is organized to address like particular existential questions. And so this goes back to what Harriet's saying, right? This is one of the reasons why it's not a popular method of therapy here, is because it takes a long time, right? Like it takes a long time to address these situations.
It's expensive.
It's expensive, right? But what's interesting is it's actually very popular in parts of the world that have national healthcare service, right?
Yeah, like France.
It's also really, really huge in South America right now. There's some interesting work because it's tied actually to social justice initiatives. So personality and pathology are kind of wrapped up the same together for everyone. Like, and our symptoms then are our personality traits and our behaviors. So borderline personality is typically understood as a person, what we would say, with a hysteric structure who's in distress. So for the person with a hysteric structure, the question that typically motivates them is their relationship to the other, with a sort of assumption that they kind of take on the assumptions about what the other person lacks. They frequently try to like ascertain the desire of what other people want for them and then try to be that. So you can probably imagine that, you know, like this is a pretty stressful situation, but most people are able to kind of sort of come to a conclusion that like X is what other people love about me, and then they kind of become that. So the earlier example of like, a little girl may learn from a young age that being a smart little girl is what is like desired of her, and then she can just be that for the other. The other being, like an early caregiver, like the mother, but that would like translate to later relationships, kind of like a blueprint. So the person with BPD, the way I understand it, may not have had the ability to really settle on an answer about what they can be for another, what is desired from them by another. And usually because, you see in the literature, they tend to have either cold or uncaring or neglectful or preoccupied primary caregivers. And typically, the old literature says mother, but I think we can update that, right? To just a family that is not always warm to the desire of the person, right? That they kind of, there's not a lot of expected from them, right? And so I think of it that way, but then can't separate it from those sociocultural issues, like the fact that the majority of people with BPD are women, that there's almost like a fear of them, right? Especially after movies like Fatal Attraction, where there's like the woman who does not respect boundaries will go so far as to destroy you, and and that can't really be separated about certain assumptions about femininity, as well as motherhood, right? And I think Lacan's understanding of that kind of helps bridge those cultural discourses and fear and anxiety with the suffering of the person. Sorry, that was kind of long-winded, but hopefully.
I think so too. And I think one of the reasons that women are diagnosed with that more than men is that, first of all, to be a good mother means to imagine the desire of an inarticulate being and to fill that child with your imagination of her, his, or their desire. Mm-hmm. And also, we are trained to be the emotional caregiver, which means that we have to imagine the unarticulated desires of our husbands and meet their inarticulate needs. That's our job as wives and mothers. It has been the emotional connectors in the family. And so that having that kind of need to be the desire of the other is powerful. And in my long experience, because I have 46 years of experience treating clients, is that the clients that I have who self-harm because they're fulfilling the desire of a partner or someone else, that they show themselves to be crazy so that they can be taken under control. Mm-hmm. And so that the social imperatives of women are entirely commingled with that diagnosis. And those aren't discussed, as Bethany, you talked about earlier. They're not in the equation, so the equation doesn't add up.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And the way that, the implicit assumptions about what is expected from women, by the culture, by their partners, by children, all of that is so deeply personal as well as alienating that it kind of manifests on the body, it manifests in relationships, it manifests in symptoms that the person themselves may not necessarily even understand why they're doing what they're doing.
Certainly,
and that's
they don't.
Yeah, and that's I think that why it's important to look at symptoms as language and not like stifle them or smother them, right? Like you don't want to get rid of a fever until you know what's causing the infection, right?
Exactly. And that's why the National Institute of Mental Health condemned the DSM-5 and the Diagnostic Statistical Manuals as sole materials to use, because they don't even ask the question, what happened? How did you get here? And therefore, like Hansel and Gretel, you could follow the pebbles in the woods and find your way back. But if you don't know how you got there, you just take a biochemical analysis and say you're unbalanced and give you drugs. You don't find out what happened and how to untangle it so a person doesn't have to be in some kind of magical meeting of the other that is so destructive to her or themselves.
Bethany, are you familiar at all with like Marsha Linehan's conceptualization of BPD and like dialectical behavioral therapy at all? I mean, it seems like very far away from your orientation, but
I'm vaguely familiar, with, but not. I wouldn't say. I don't even familiar may even be too strong of a word, but I'm a little bit familiar with dialectical behavioral, and I don't really have any specific like insights on her work in particular, but I typically am a little hesitant with any sort of cognitive behavioral approach. I think that there's plenty that can be done with it, especially in like an immediate stressful situation, right? Like it's going to be hard to go into analysis if you're having panic attacks, right? Like you need to do something in the immediate situation. But that I sort of have problems with, well, not sort of, I do have problems with those theories that don't really wrestle with the unconscious. And I think sometimes CBT and DBT can be accused of that, that they, as I understand DBT, it works in some issue or works in like mindfulness and acceptance, which I think is really helpful in certain situations, provided it's not doing like what we're talking about, is like stifling those symptoms or shutting down conversations and shutting down like the subject's, I say subject, but like the person's curiosity about themselves and where this is coming from in the first place, you know?
yeah. And I mean, we really don't have the time for it just since we got a little bit started late. So I was trained in DBT, like really extensive. I'm not DBT certified because it's like, you have to do so much to get certified. I was like pretty close, and then long story, but so I appreciate it a lot. I actually feel almost like I want to protect my little DBT a little bit. I almost want to defend it a little bit, but also I think coming from a more zoomed out, you know, sort of, I guess, leftist perspective, I do think that I'm not going to rant about it, but yeah, I do agree. I guess, okay, I'll just say this. I think the utility of it is that it was, so Marsha Linehan herself was like chronically suicidal, was hospitalized multiple times. And I think it almost from a almost like peer perspective, like somebody that was going through it, that tried to create something that was like meant to like first stabilize those who just like cannot, like there's no way that they're ever going to be able to do like long-term psychoanalysis in the state that they're in, get people stabilized so that they can, you know, build what's called like a life worth living. But I do think that generally it is of the CBT flavor, right? Like I think that's where it it's like kind of too bad. And I've heard about some I know there's some psychoanalytic traditions that are trying to do shorter term things to sort of compete with this whole world now, and I don't really know anything about that, but I guess there's been some like evidence that briefer psychoanalytic approaches have actually been okay, like mentalization. I don't even know much about that, but
but also hypnosis is a brief way of doing a Lacanian analysis. Okay. Also, what Bethany said before really applies to DBT. If you go with the current behavior, you could see it with a Lacanian eye as a system of signs, and follow the signs, and so that it would be something that could coexist nicely with a Lacanian analytic framework.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think a lot of the Lacanian, not all of it, but a lot of Lacanian practice in the United States right now is done in counseling, right? And done in under the guise of other things, because it's so hard to get psychoanalysis in this country, right? Because you're looking at least once a week, every week for years, right? That's a commitment that most people cannot afford or have time for. And so I know plenty of DBT, CBT clinicians who are certified clinicians who would essentially bring in a lot of their the Lacanian or psychoanalytic ethics to their DBT and CBT practice, because the idea, right, is to get the person talking. And like you're saying, if you're, Max, like if you're in a state of distress, there, you have to live too, right? And so these approaches are great for addressing immediate situations, certain contexts, and to essentially get the person ready to address issues and start talking and investigating themselves.
Well, and psychoanalysis, I think, is like psychologically destabilizing in a lot of ways, right? It's almost intended to like have you just get in there, and shit's supposed to get kind of messy and kind of painful. And if somebody's like on the brink of suicide or self-harm or whatever, I mean, I do think there's a good case to be made that like, look, they're not ready for that kind of work yet. Right? We have to get them to where like they're not going to kill themselves, they're not going to end up hospitalized and stuff. But I actually think there's probably good counter arguments to that, and that I think the sort of legalistic, litigative culture we live in, all these liabilities and stuff, where it's like, okay, we need to use the most evidence-based practice to make sure people don't kill themselves. I mean, this is the kind of thing I think I've said this once or twice on the podcast, and I feel weird saying it sometimes because I swear all it takes is someone from the Board of Behavioral Sciences hearing me say this, and they're like, okay, but like, our entire conceptualization of suicidality and self-harm and destructive behaviors, I think, in the psychology world is huge, is very negatively impacted by this sort of litigative liability fear, to where I think we can't even have like a helpful conversation about it, right? Where it's just like, well, now we just have to do whatever covers our ass most, versus like,
right.
And like once that's the primary goal of the clinician, I actually feel like there's something sort of in anti-humanistic and anti-existential and anti-connective that can occur, not necessarily. Also, I'm just noticing the time, and that since we're doing Zoom now, it's going to kick us out in 3 minutes. Crap. I think we're going to have to close out, and it's going to have to be shorter, unfortunately.
Well, this is a wonderful discussion, and I hope that it provokes our listeners the way it's provoked Max and me, and I hope you too, Bethany.
Yeah, this was great.
Maybe we could do it again and kind of, because it sounds like there's probably a lot more we could get into here. This is like I feel like we could get warmed up a little bit. I really wanted to ask you about incels. That really fascinates me as well. I know you've done some work on that.
Well, that would be a wonderful topic. Insights on incels.
Listeners, if you want to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/itsnotjustinyourhead. If you want to contact us, you have anything to say about this conversation, or you want to have us pass that on to Bethany, you can email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. And
we love you even though you're not on Patreon, but we really appreciate the support you give us on Patreon as well.
I'll just say it, love you. Yes, we love you.
Yes.
Yes, we do. Unconditionally, I think. Do we love everyone?
Yes.
Do we love everyone unconditionally? That's like a whole podcast episode.
In a general way. We should thank Bethany, because this has been really thought-provoking, Bethany. It's important. I hope you do come back and talk about incels, because they're such a political bomb as well as a misogynist bomb and a Trumpist bomb, and deserve to be explored and exposed.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah.
Good. We'll arrange it.
It's a really important topic.
It is.
Okay, Bethany. Yeah, sorry again because of time and tech issues. We got to end early, but we'll stay in contact and try to make this happen again sometime.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's Not Just in Your Head and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.